So let me introduce Alan Rudolph. He's the Vice President of Research here at Colorado State University. And look in the bio and in your printed program as well as the live streamers. You can go on the website to see his bio. It's very impressive. I'm not going to read it, but we're very blessed to have Alan Rudolph here at Colorado State University. Take it away.
There. Good morning. Really delighted to be here and have the introduction to this session around solutions. And it's a little bit of a different session than we've had in this meeting over the few years, where the CSU participation had been sprinkled throughout the course of the meeting. And in the steering committee, we decided that this was a year, especially bringing it back to Fort Collins, to really showcase in a more focused way what we do and think about in this area. And you know, I think it has really broad tentacles into a lot of issues which we hope will be brought out during the course of the session. And it has certainly the flavor of CSU to it. The gentlemen on the stage here with me are all CSU faculty. But I think it's important to stress at the outset that we understand in putting this session together that we're anchoring the discussion around CSU, but the interfaces of the university with the community, the civic community, industrial community, many of the stakeholders that we know are key to be involved with participating in these solutions is really what we represent. And so while we anchor the stage with CSU, I think appropriately for the conference in relation to the session you heard before, even Fred Krupp's remarks last night about the interfaces of these stakeholders and how key it is to seeing solutions really implemented. And so what I hope you get out of this session as you hear the passion and the vision from CSU faculty is how they think about integrating their voice into the stakeholder community. How do they partner? How do we partner with the community in order to see these solutions mature, translate the technologies out of the university environments, that things that are challenging to do in any sector, let alone the energy sector. But it's really about the relationships and the movement of those relationships from the university. And so, you know, you'll hear about technology solutions, and you'll hear about issues, but we're also going to bring out, you know, important points around what is our role, how do we deal with the issue of bias and its perception and working in various communities, how can we be better at translating ideas and discovery and moving them out of the university and into the places of impact. And of course, all of that is grounded in the fact that we're a land-grant university with this heritage of doing science for a social mission. It's very much ingrained in who we are and the fabric of what this university is about. The other thing I'll mention, and being a relatively new resident of Colorado and a new resident of the university community, is people often ask me, what is it like to be at Colorado State University? I don't have a lot of my own academic experience, so this is new to me, but I often describe it as being dropped into MacGyver University. And I say that for those of you who may remember MacGyver, is that I think one of the pride points that CSU has in its role in this sector in looking at the aspects which I talked about earlier is that it doesn't start with a big resource allocation from on high, or yes, we compete well for fundings, for sponsors from federal grants, from industry, but we do create and innovate with a very mentality around getting it done, not necessarily getting it paid for in a large way up front. And that's a spirit that I think is really unique to this university, somewhat related to the land grant nature of focusing on the impact. And so I hope that comes out during the course of the morning, and really excited to introduce the the 6 speakers we have, and then we'll have some dialogue afterward. So we're going to hear from Jeff Collett, Ken Carlson, Tony Marchese, Dan Zimmerle, Mark Paschke, and Azer Yalin in order for different things that they'll talk about that are related to solutions, technology solutions. But we've also asked them in their 5 minutes to represent the consortia and the ideas that they have in terms of how are they moving, where's their maturity, who are they working with. And we'll tease out some of those other issues that I mentioned earlier in the introduction here shortly. So let's go ahead and dive in, and we'll start with our first speaker, Jeff Collett. He's a professor and head of Department of Atmospheric Sciences. As you may know, we have one of the leading atmospheric sciences department in the country, and Jeff will be talking about volatile organic carbon studies in Garfield County in the Front Range. Jeff.
Thank you, Alan. Sorry for those of you that had to listen to me yesterday and have to listen again, but I'll keep this short. And I want to talk today a little bit more specifically about some of the work that we're doing, looking at air emissions and air quality impacts and potential impacts from oil and gas. MacGyver's a pretty high standard to live up to, but we try and do our best to try and fill in some gaps in knowledge about emissions and their impacts. And this first slide just has a few pictures that I think illustrate some of the kinds of work that we do. And I'll say a little bit about our work in Garfield County here on the Front Range, but I'll also highlight a couple of other projects we're doing in this space and some of the other partners that we work with there. So we are really experimental field people. We go out to try and make measurements, to make observations of what's going on out in the real world. And we collaborate a lot with people that do computer modeling of different things. But my group really focuses on these sorts of field measurements. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I don't do most of this work. Most of this work is actually done by some of my faculty colleagues, but especially a lot of the research staff who I've listed on this slide, and a lot of really talented graduate students that have also worked on some of these projects. So we're working sort of in 3 areas right now, and one is the one that's listed in the program. This is air emissions research, where we're really looking at the characterizing emissions of air toxics, of precursors to ozone formation and methane, and their nearby dispersion. And we're doing this really in 2 areas. The first study we got involved with is in Garfield County. Garfield County has been a real leader, a partnership there between the county government and industry and citizen groups to try and address concerns about possible impacts. There's a second one on the Front Range, and I'll talk a little bit more about these studies in a moment. We also have worked for a long time on regional air quality issues from lots of different types of sources, and recently those have involved more oil and gas focus to some of them. We worked for several years with Shell up in Boulder, Wyoming. We've worked with the National Park Service in the Bakken field of North Dakota and in Rocky Mountain National Park, and we're working with the city of Fort Collins here on a small project right now. And then sort of a new area for us is getting involved more directly in air toxics measurements, and we're working on a new project with the town of Timnath, which is nearby here, where there are concerns about new wells going in close to an elementary school and trying to address some of the possible public concerns there. So just a little bit about a couple of these focus areas. We have 2 large studies looking at air emissions. The one in Garfield County is now nearing the end of 3 years. We're getting close to the end of that study. And we're trying to really fill gaps in knowledge about emissions from especially new well drilling and completions operations. We've heard a lot about emissions, especially for methane, over the course of this symposium so far. Not many people are focusing on new wells, and that was a particular focal area for this study in Garfield County. In addition, we're looking at methane, but really our higher priorities for that study are on air toxics like benzene and precursors to ozone formation. But of course, we do methane while we're out there as well. This study is a partnership, as I mentioned, between Garfield County and industry. We have industry funding, and we rely on access from industry to do our experiments. We actually go on site, we release tracers, and we use those to quantify emissions from the sites. And we have a similar study running in the Front Range. It's running several months behind in terms of the schedule relative to Garfield County. It's also looking at new wells, and it's looking a bit at production and some other processes as well. This study is funded primarily by the state, by CDPHE, but the city of Fort Collins has contributed to this as well. And here we have a couple of industry partners, and I hope we're really close to getting a couple of other industry partners on board. But the hallmarks of these studies really are this close cooperation between an academic research group like ours, local or state government, and industry. And having all those people at the table makes a lot of difference. It gives us access. We don't have to sit outside a facility and guess at what's going on as we're measuring emissions. We have access to go on facility. We get information from the operator about what they're doing at the time we're making emissions measurements, which is really valuable. The other thing I'll mention briefly is our focus on fine particle and haze formation. Those of you that were here yesterday heard me talk a little bit about this issue of fine particle nitrate, which is a concern in some areas. And really what we're looking at is highlighted here. Oil and gas related combustion activities emit nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere, especially in the winter when conditions are stagnant. Those emissions accumulate and we get reaction to form nitric acid. That nitric acid then combines with ammonia, which is not coming, as far as we know, from oil and gas. We don't see evidence of that. It tends to come mainly from agriculture. But together those things form fine particles of ammonium nitrate that lead to haze issues and lead to elevated particle concentrations that are also of potential concern for human health. And two areas that we've worked on this are up in the Jonah-Pinedale area in Wyoming, where we've worked with Shell for several years. And we were trying to understand there how their emissions of NOx, not just Shell, but other operators in the basin were impacting particle formation. And the situation is there that they do get, of course, have NOx emissions. Those react to form nitric acid in the stagnant winter environment. But there's really very little ammonia around in that environment in the winter. And they've also worked quite hard using selective catalytic reduction to reduce NOx emissions because of the ozone issues. And so what we find there is very limited fine particle formation. We don't see buildup of real strong haze episodes. I'll contrast that with a different basin. We've worked with the National Park Service up in the Bakken oil patch, and there we have some of the same sorts of situations. In the winter, the wind blows a lot, but when it stops, these emissions accumulate. We get this conversion to nitric acid, and there we have quite a bit more ammonia around. So we have more NOx, we have more ammonia, and we end up producing substantial concentrations of ammonium nitrate particles. So the point of telling you these two stories is to illustrate that the controls of emissions are important, but it's not just the emissions from oil and gas, it's the interaction of emissions from different types of sources that ultimately can impact the air quality that we're all experiencing. So we need to think about this as one segment of a larger population of emissions that interact in different environments in different ways. So I will wrap things up there and hand it over to Ken.
And Ken Carlson will be next.
So I, like Jeff, you heard from me yesterday, so this is going to be short. As I said, the two main categories we care about are quantity and quality with respect to water, and I'm going to focus on the two solution-driven projects we've been doing with respect to quality. And the first is really the second bullet there, which is beneficial reuse. And I also talked about this yesterday, and this is really the sort of vision that we have in our mind is how do we get to beneficial reuse that is very flexible. And that means it doesn't just take a relatively poor quality water and send it back to the oil field for more fracking. I mean, that is a perfectly legitimate reuse, but there has to be more to that. And there's the barriers are really cost and regulations, and we're working through both of those. We're partnered with 2 water treatment companies, a midstream company, because we believe that the solution is probably related somewhat to gas gathering and water gathering at the same time. And this has to be done at a cost that's competitive with current practice, which is disposal to a large extent. And the other thing we're doing is we're working with Noble. We collect their water. We're using that as sort of our tough water to treat. And in our lab, we're doing various experiments with, like I said, different water treatment companies to try to it can be done. Water can be treated to anything we want it to be treated to, but it needs to be done cost effectively, and that's the focus. The other water quality component, like I said yesterday, is contamination. And so we started this Colorado Water Watch maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. Phase 1 was really building it out. Phase 2 has been proof of concept, and we've been real-time monitoring we're putting our 10th well in this month. Well, it rained, so it'll probably be early next month. But Noble has been the, let's say, bricks and mortar supporter. It's also been supported by DNR, COGCC, steering committee chaired by Bill Ritter and Mike King, Kate Fay, Matt Lepore, president of Western Resource Advocates, John Golden Dubois. The point was to give the public real-time data that they could understand, and like I said, it's being done pretty much right on the pad, and we're hoping to expand it. I think we're through the proof of concept phase, and I have the URL up there if you want to visit it if you haven't, and some pictures of what it looks like, what some of the installations look like. We're actually going to a new system that won't have that big box. It'll just have the well and the telemetry, and the measurement probes will be in the well casing itself. And so along these lines, we've taken the opportunity to in conjunction with COGCC, using mostly their data, some of the data we've collected, and published 2 articles recently, one in Water Research, one in Environmental Science and Technology, on potential contamination in the Wattenberg. So we did a pretty thorough analysis, and I'll just leave it at that, as we looked at 2 different mechanisms, stray gas or casing failures. If anybody's interested in getting these journal articles, just email me. I think our email addresses are in they've got to be somewhere, but you can always track us down if we're at the university. So that's all I was going to talk about. Anthony?
Next will be Tony Marchese he's the Director of Engines and Energy Conversion Lab and a professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at CSU. He'll be talking more about methane emissions.
Okay, so last night Fred Krupp talked about the EDF-sponsored methane emission studies, and this is one of the 16 studies sponsored by EDF, and here we were focusing on methane emissions from gathering and processing. How do I advance this here? Got it upside down. So first I want to acknowledge the partners. So EDF organizes and partially funds these studies, but then they also help recruit partner companies to actually also fund the study. So our study was funded by Anadarko, Access, Midstream, Williams, SWN, Hess, and also DCP Midstream didn't fund the study, but they provided access to some of their facilities. And in sum total, we had 738 gathering facilities that we had access to and 28 processing plants. And Colorado State University, myself and Dan Zimmerle were the lead PIs on the study, and we also worked with Carnegie Mellon and Aerodyne on our field campaign. So what is gathering? Gathering, and particularly and gathering and processing, is pretty much everything downstream of a well site and anything upstream of transmission. And so there are a lot of operations and systems there. And what's interesting, particularly in gathering, is that this sector is largely unregulated and largely unreported with regards to methane emissions. So it was a big unknown what the emissions were when we started out on this project. And what these gathering systems really look like are quite complex. So what you see in all the red there are miles and miles of gathering pipeline. This is one very small particular gathering system here in the Front Range. So you see tens of thousands of miles of pipeline and maybe 10 gathering stations and maybe 2 processing plants. That would be a typical gathering network. And so there are a lot of opportunities for methane to actually leak out of a system like that. Here's what a gathering facility looks like in real life. So the overhead view, they're fairly large facilities, but they're also typically unmanned. So somebody might visit such a facility once per day, but there's nobody there 24/7 to monitor the methane emissions. And so there's systems like very large engines and compressors, dehydration systems, and sometimes amine treatment systems as well. So this is a map of the United States. So these were all the facilities that we had access to. So we had 20 weeks to hit as many facilities as possible and to measure the methane emissions from these facilities. And in 20 weeks, those are the areas that we visited, and all in told, we measured emissions from 114 gathering facilities and 28 processing plants. Now, the way we do these measurements is we actually try to capture the total methane emissions emanating from a facility. So we use a tracer gas technique. We actually release nitrous oxide and acetylene at known concentrations, at known flow rates. And then about a mile downwind, we drive through this plume, and it's a plume of methane coming from the site, but also the tracer gases. And since we know the exact rate at which we're releasing the tracer gases, we can back out the total flow rate of methane from these facilities. And that's what the equipment looks like in real life. So just quickly to get to the results. So what we found let me see if I can play this movie. Which button would one press to play a movie? Okay, it's not playing. Let's try it one more time. Is anything happening? Okay, well, oh well. But basically what we found with gathering is about 40% of our facilities were actually losing more than 0.5% of their methane. And what we found in many cases, it was some sort of a disruption in a process such that methane was venting. It's the way these facilities are designed to work. We found many facilities that had less than 0.1% of emissions. So the real takeaway here is that the methane emissions can actually be reduced with different operating practices and monitoring. And finally, so just the final results here that Fred Krupp actually hinted at. So really what we found is that gathering emissions are much higher, we believe, than what's in the EPA inventory. So right now, for total gathering and processing, the EPA inventory would suggest about 1,300 gigograms of methane emissions. We suggest that it's about 2,400 gigograms. And what that means in terms of a loss rate is that in the EPA inventory would suggest about a 0.25% methane loss rate, and we're predicting about a 0.47% methane loss rate. So one of the great things about these studies is that we interact with the EPA and hopefully in new versions of the EPA inventory, the our study will impact the inventory as we'll put some of these results in new inventories. So I'll move on now to Dan Zimmerle, who's going to talk about transmission and storage.
Thanks, Tony. Dan Zimmerle is a senior research associate and the director of the Electrical Power System Laboratory at CSU, also a member of the Energy Research Institute. Dan?
Thank you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the university, and I always like to tease my colleagues a little bit, is that if you're not tenure track, they don't let you wear a tie. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about emissions from transmission and storage. Transmission and the storage part of the natural gas system is the transportation system that moves gas basically from the processing plants that Anthony just talked about, or from the gathering fields directly to the consumer. So either power plants or residential type consumers, industrial type consumers. And the study that I'm going to talk about, two studies today. One of those is related particularly to transmission and storage, and then the second one is related to a new project we just started that's looking at the reconciliation of basin level emissions. So a couple things about the study of transmission and storage is this is a very dispersed set of facilities. And so what we've done is partner up with a number of companies. We moved down their systems, basically making samples. We were at about 45 facilities, like 9 storage and the rest were transmission. One of the key things that keeps coming up in these studies from a methodological standpoint is whether we're catching everything. So are these good measurements? So in this study, we took a particular pairing type of measurement methodology where we created an on-site survey, very similar to what's done in greenhouse gas reporting program, but a lot more detailed than that, where we took people and went along, as it shows on the bottom picture there, doing individual source measurements using kind of the standard tools for doing those. In addition, at the same time, we took measurements downwind using the same tracer gas measurement that Jeff and Anthony talked about before. That allowed us to get some paired measurements results between those two different methods and to do that simultaneously. Now, I'm not going to go through the results because they're pretty cumbersome and complex, but let me say that what we found was that within experimental and modeling uncertainty, we found roughly the same amount of emissions in our study as are in the greenhouse gas inventory study. However, what was underneath that was actually significantly different. And there's two parts to that equation. One of them is counting noses, if you will. How many facilities are there? What kind of equipment is on the facilities? What are their operational cadence and that type of thing? And it turns out those numbers are very hard to acquire, both for the gathering and processing study and also for transmission and storage. And then the second thing we found was that the greenhouse gas inventory, while it was kind of coming up with the right aggregate number, it didn't get there sort of, at least in our opinion, the right way. So there's been some significant shifts in the systems that are on transmission storage facilities that have really changed the way and the mix of what the emissions are. Without access to these facilities, without being able to get this data back from the partners as well as the measurements that we were doing, we would not have insight into this. And I think a large part of what we were finding were the things like moving from different types of pneumatic devices, changing to different types of compressors is having a big impact, generally positive, on the emissions from these facilities. Now I'm going to talk about a second project that we were just engaging in. In fact, my team just returned from field study about a week and a half ago. And what we're looking at is what we call basin level reconciliation. So out there in the audience, people are saying, well, what's a basin and why would you reconcile it? Okay. So what we find is that there's, when you fly over the top of a basin and you make measurements, you come up with a number for what the emissions of methane should be in that basin. You get a number X. If you then go run around in the basin and you take detailed measurements and you add them up, you get another estimate, and that's roughly Y. And of course, X doesn't equal Y. And in fact, the kind of the way it's been shaking out is that X is about 2X what Y is. Okay, so what we're doing right now is a study to try to answer the question, of why there's this difference between these big aggregate emissions flying over the top, looking at kind of sort of regional air movement, and comparing that to what's happening at the basin level. And so this is a very interesting study funded by the RPSEA program as part of the Department of Energy, and some partner companies as well. And I can't tell you what the basin is that we were at, but I can tell you a little bit about the methodology we did. So we have 3 levels of measurement. At the top level, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration did some overflights with airplanes and made estimates of the amount of emissions at the basin level. Simultaneously, we did measurements downwind using tracer measurements and another method developed by EPA called OTM33A that gave us facility level emissions. And then finally, we had a number of people who were on the facility actually making point source measurements. And we had another team that was driving down gathering lines looking for emissions from gathering lines. So this gives us kind of this sandwich effect where we can now compare facilities, emissions at a facility level, emissions at a basin level, and we can do that with a number of different measurement techniques. And we're hoping that will help close the gap between the two, and or tell us where we're making mistakes. Now I want to close sort of philosophically here a little bit about what's behind these projects. Besides their unique ability to increase the number of gray hair I have, what it takes to do these studies is participation by a really wide range of players. And so we've been able to bring together folks from like environmental groups who have a great deal of scientific knowledge that they've been able to contribute. EDF was a big funder of the TNS study, and we've had other groups involved with the current study that we're doing at the basin level. We've had interactions with the public. We have access to facilities from the industry, and we've had some interaction with the government regulatory authorities to provide data. And if you didn't get all of those ingredients together, pieces of the insight you would get from these studies would disappear. And it's because we have that level of insight into the facilities and into the different operations has really provided us a way of making comparison at a much richer level than we would otherwise have been able to do. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Mark.
And next up will be Mark Paschke. He's a professor in the Shell Endowed Chair of Restoration Ecology in the Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship in the Warner College of Natural Resources.
Thanks. So similar to what you've heard this morning, the project I'm going to talk to you about involves a lot of different players. And see if I can get that right. Whoa, went too far, sorry. So the project I'm going to tell you about involves restoring populations of threatened plants in the Piceance Basin, and I should come clean right away and admit I'm not an engineer or a geologist. So realizing I'm in a room full of engineers and geologists, when I talk about plants, I'm talking about these things here, okay, and the green things in the picture up there. So this is a project that came together as a collaborative effort between XTO Energy, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, the Denver Botanic Gardens. There was a lot of different players involved here, and it centers around a challenge that was occurring over in the Piceance Basin in northwest Colorado, where there were issues surrounding energy development and the associated potential impact on 2 federally listed plant species. So those of you that are familiar with the Piceance Basin over in northwest Colorado, it has very unique geology. There's an abundance of mineral and energy resources that results from that unique geology that occurs there. But because there's this unique geology, it creates unique substrates for plants to grow on, and it's led to the evolution of unique plant species that occur there and nowhere else in the world. And the plants I'm going to be talking to you about are ones that grow on these white shale outcrops that you see scattered throughout this photo here. And these 2 plant species, the only place they grow are on these white shale outcrops. What's interesting about these 2 plants is they occur in some of these outcrops, but not all of them. So one of the questions we're interested in understanding is why these plants only occur in some places and not other places where they ought to be able to grow. And that leads to some questions about how we might tackle some of these problems. Here's one of these plants, Phaceria congesta, also known as the Dudley Bluffs bladder pod, and it's about the size of a dime. So that's a very close-up picture there. And the other is Phaceria obcordata, or the Piant's twin pod. Both federally listed, both creating a lot of headaches for the BLM, Fish and Wildlife, and the industry. So in the MacGyver-like approach that we take at CSU, the approach, rather naive, I might admit, that we took at CSU was that if these are plants that we don't have enough of, let's make more of them. And that's what we set out to do in this research, was to figure out if there are ways that we can increase the population sizes of these plants to eventually perhaps make them delisted if we were ever successful in getting that far. So our research question really was to determine if we can establish new populations of these plant species in suitable but unoccupied habitats. And again, we have a unique situation here in the Piance Basin with these plants in that they occur on some of these white shale outcrops, but not very many of them. So there's a lot of them that are empty, devoid of these plants. And we were interested in finding out if we can get these plants growing on some of the areas where they currently don't occur. So if we could do that, we would potentially come up with a tool that could be then used by industry and the government to restore these populations, perhaps to mitigate for impacts to these, and eventually, in the long term, the goal would be to future delisting of these plant species if we could create enough new populations of them. So the way we went about this, we collected a lot of seed, took a lot of time to collect the seed, get the permits to do that. We did, not we, but the Denver Botanic Gardens did genetic analysis of all the different seed populations we were looking at. We did lab and greenhouse propagation studies, lots of them trying to figure out how to grow these plants. It turns out they're really easy to grow. We did soil feedback studies. The reason we did that is one of the sort of current leading theories about why particular plants are rare and others are not so rare has to do with the way they interact with soil microbial communities. And it's thought that some rare plants have a lot of soil pathogens that build up in the soils. And if you envision these plants growing in these little tiny isolated pockets, there's potential for soil pathogens to build up over time if these plants can't move around in the environment. And we wanted to make sure that that wasn't happening with these plants because we were talking about perhaps moving them around. So we wanted to understand the feedbacks they were having with soil microbial communities. Ultimately, we did field plot seeding. We wanted to see if we could put seeds of these plants in areas where they weren't currently growing to see if we could establish them. And we also did transplants of these plants. What we found was there was no difference in greenhouse plants grown in soils from occupied versus unoccupied but suitable habitats. That told us that there wasn't any of these negative feedbacks going on, which was a relief because that told us that we could move these plants around in the environment without having to worry about them being killed by soil pathogens, for example, in their new habitats. What we found so far is very little or no establishment from seeds. So where we put seeds in the ground of these plants in these new habitats, we didn't see any or very few seedlings emerge. But that's only after 1 year. Typically when we plant mustard plants, which are what these plants ultimately are, it takes sometimes 2, 3, 4, 5 years before you see those seeds emerge. So we're still hopeful we might see something there. We had very low survival with our initial transplants that were done last fall, but we had very good survival, at least so far, of transplants that we put in the spring of this year. We'll have to wait to see how they survive the winter, but even though these numbers are very low, they're very encouraging. Typically when we transplant plants in any sort of a restoration project, if we can hit 50% survival, we're doing pretty good. So with these rare species, we're very happy so far with how things are going. So preliminary conclusions, it seems like it is fairly feasible to establish new populations of these plants. And this could be a viable management tool for dealing with these issues in the past. So far, transplants appear to be much better, but we have to probably wait several more years before we can decide whether seeding versus transplants are the best way to approach this issue. So I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Mark. And our last speaker will be Azer Yalin, a professor of mechanical engineering and the director for the Center of Laser Sensing and Diagnostics.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be speaking to you about our work developing laser sensors to measure methane in the atmosphere. And a little bit of background, first of all. Most of my career has actually been using laser diagnostics to study plasma and combustion, but very similar tools can be used for these types of atmospheric measurements. So I've been moving into that field. And hopefully it's clear from several of the earlier talks, basically the importance of these types of measurements. So for environmental characterization, to understand these kind of basin-wide budgets, to meet regulations, all of these things require measurements of emissions. And so having appropriate sensor tools to make those measurements is really critical. So I'm going to have two aims really in the next 5 minutes or so. One of them is to just give you a bit more of a kind of nuts and bolts feel of how some of these sensors work and how one should think about the performance of a sensor. And then the other one will be to talk more specifically about a new sensor that we're developing in our research group. So before I focus in on our sensor, I just want to give you a flavor that there's quite diverse types of instruments that can be used to make these types of measurements. Some of them are more for visualization, some of them are more quantitative. There's also a number of programs underway around the country developing new sensor approaches. So just for a quick feel, you can see the image in the top left, I think. Yes, that is your top left as well. So you can use these infrared cameras, and so you can see these plumes coming off of these facilities, which would be invisible by eye. So very useful, but it only allows detection of relatively large emissions, and it's not really directly quantitative. There's instruments, as shown in the top right, where you essentially point a laser at a potential source, and then it measures along the path of that laser. So those are used a lot by service personnel who visit different sites looking for leaks. Very useful, but they tend to only be applicable at fairly short standoff distances. You couldn't stand half a mile away and point that thing and get a meaningful result. There's passive sensors being developed, shown on the bottom left as an example. So those sensors are very low cost, and so they have a role too, but they're not mobile and they don't give time-resolved information. And then in the bottom right is kind of I think it'd be fair to say, the gold standard type instrument right now, which is a cavity ring down type instrument. And so some of these more sophisticated studies, as have been done by several of the earlier speakers, use those types of sensors. So our sensor is actually kind of a different flavor of this cavity ring down sensor. So the way these sensors work, and again, I'll try not to make this too excruciating detail, but I think it's interesting to give you a flavor, is that the gas that you're studying resides inside of what's called an optical cavity, which means it's between a pair of those those are high reflectivity mirrors. And you basically shine a laser beam in there and it bounces back and forth thousands of times, gives you a very long path length and high sensitivity to quantitatively measure specific gases with part per billion type precision, which is what we need. Our version of that is shown on the bottom left. And what we're doing differently from the commercial instruments is that we are open path. And that means that we don't have an inlet tube and a flow cell and a vacuum pump. Rather, we just measure directly between our mirrors. And that has the advantage that the equipment can become much smaller and lighter weight, like 3 kilograms or so. Whereas the one I showed you on the last slide, by the time you put in the vacuum pump, is more like a 30 kilogram instrument. One of the challenges is that when we measure this way, we have atmospheric particles, dust, or aerosols going through the optical cavity. And so in the bottom right, you can see the raw measurement and this kind of huge scatter of red dots. And so we've developed some software filters to maintain high signal to noise in the presence of that type of a signal. So if you have a sensor, you need to characterize its accuracy, its precision, its time response. And so we've been doing that, of course, with our sensor. The graph on the top left shows a comparison against a sort of heavier, expensive commercial instrument, and we get very nice agreement. The graph on the bottom left, I won't go into the detail, but that's called an Allen variance study, and that allows one to understand the precision of the instrument. And our instrument has a precision of approximately 10 to 30 parts per billion of methane in 1 second. So then the question is, well, that's nice, but what do you need? And so that's addressed in the graph on the right from the EPA, and that shows how much the methane concentration increases above the ambient background level as a function of emission rate. And then there's a bunch of color-coded points which are measurements at different distances from the source. And so, of course, the further from the source you are, then for a given emission, this increase in concentration reduces and reduces. But basically, the conclusion from our contacts at the EPA and from other people we speak to is that about 100 parts per billion is what you need, and below that really isn't particularly useful. And so because our instrument is in this 10 to 30 part per billion range, we're excited that we have effectively in a smaller, lighter weight package an instrument that still is very sufficient to measure leaks of practical interest. So we're interested, of course, in deploying this sensor, and that's what we're working towards now. And some examples of that are shown in this slide. So on the left is kind of a hybrid deployment in a basin where we would mount this lightweight sensor onto some drones or UAVs. We would fly those above different potential emitters. We would combine the concentrations with the geospatial information, the wind speeds, and we would quantify and identify leaks. And essentially one can do a rather similar approach with service trucks that drive through these regions if we were to mount our sensor on the roof of those trucks. And the EPA has developed a measurement protocol that's illustrated in the top right. That's not our truck, but that's showing this idea of driving the sensor around on the truck. And on the bottom right is a picture of what our sensor would look like mounted onto a truck like that. And then I'm probably moving through my time. So very quickly, in the spirit of making an impact, being a land-grant university, CSU is very supportive of spin-out companies. And so we are beginning a company to develop this sensor, and we call this Sensor as a Service. So it's not just the sensor, but it's also the data analytics and the operations that go with it. So coming soon to a basin near you will be our OpenPath sensors from MR Sure Research. Thank you.
Yes, let's give a round of applause for all the speakers, please. So that was really great. You, first of all, we got through 6 talks in reasonably amount of time. So that's amazing on itself. But I hope you appreciated the breadth of sort of approach here. I mean, we heard talks related to technologies and in the application of technologies. We heard talks related to information gathering, data gathering for the community. And we heard a talk related to the ecosystem, how we're considering the environment around, the biodiversity, speciation around the industry. And this is just a sampling of 6. I think the great thing about CSU is in this space we're very rich in terms of doing science and its application in the sectors we're talking about over the next few days. But it does give you as an audience lots of places to grab on. So I want you to be thinking of questions either as they relate to the technologies you heard, the kind of reporting and that we did with EDF, seminal in the industry around methane and the ecosystem. So there are lots of places that I think as an audience you can grab on and ask some questions. And what we'll do is, like the other sessions, we'll drive some questions up from here, the stage, but then turn to see what questions you might have, and then we'll look for the Great Wall of Lunch opening up on the right here sometime, and I promise not to keep you past that. So I guess as I portended in the introduction, one of the things that we ask ourselves, and I think this is a great conference to bring this question forward, is the issue of how as a land-grant university, what is our role in the ecosystem of players in this industry space? Clearly neutrality, and we're a public university, land-grant university, you've heard. Neutrality is an important concept we hold dear. Just some backdrop for you. The federal funding picture is ever more competitive, and while many of our faculty still enjoy federal funding, we're roughly about a $320 million research enterprise, 70% coming from federal federal agencies, the pressure for getting federal grants and the competitiveness has led many universities, including ours, to reach out and diversify our sponsorship in industry and foundations. And clearly, as you heard the 6 speakers, very much engaged with industry and foundations, and some of them enjoying support from them. And of course, that raises the immediate issue of neutrality and how is it held, how is it managed. And I'd like to ask our speakers to address that in the context of bias. I mean, I think in other industries, you may have watched over the summer the beverage industry, especially around those that include sugar in their beverages, were under attack with regard to the bias around diabetes and metabolic research. I think we see this often in the interplay between industry and science, the question about neutrality, bias, and how do we maintain a role that benefits the public, meets our land-grant mission, but also serves side by side with industry. And I don't say this as a barrier, but as an opportunity to talk about and bring forward how our faculty think about this and how, as an institution, we manage this very important role that we play. So let me open it up to our 6 speakers, see who would like to speak on the topic of, in your experiences working with industry, how have you dealt with this issue of neutrality and bias and some of the perceptive lenses, either by the community or the industry, with what we do and how we do it?
I'll take a shot. I think the type of research you're doing plays into that. Like if you're identifying problems, if you're identifying leaks, if you're identifying spills, that's more challenging. But if you're identifying solutions, like one of the things we're doing both of these, but one of the things we're doing is trying to help companies recycle water. That's hard to come across as being biased, because who can argue with that? That's a good thing. But I think if you are collecting data to sort of characterize a problem, which I think many of us have done, that's more challenging. And maybe you want to comment on that.
If I can talk a little bit about the EDF organized studies. As I mentioned and Dan mentioned, we partner with industry on these projects, but it was very clear from the beginning that our results were going to be published in peer-reviewed journals. All of the studies had independent science advisory panels that helped us develop our test protocols and then also reviewed the results before we went to peer review. But as Dan mentioned, to do these studies right, having access to the facilities that the companies own, but also the operating data. So they shared with us the flow rates and gas compositions and detailed equipment lists. So we had access to all that information. I will say, I didn't mention, but we had 800 some facilities to choose from, but we selected those facilities at random. And we were escorted out to the facilities by the companies, but they let us alone on their facilities for a day to do the measurements. I will say there is always the chance for bias here, and one of the things I think that we recognize is if that a company is not only going to give us access to their sites, but actually to help fund the study, I think we all probably recognize that the companies that volunteer to be part of these studies are probably companies that are doing things the right way, or at least to the fullest extent possible. So we do recognize, and I think Dan can talk about this, that the measurements that are not, the emissions from our non-partner companies may be different from the emissions that we measure at our partner companies. Maybe you can.
Yes. You never know whether these are going to start or not. Okay. Here you go. You can have that. We've cut you off, Anthony. So I think that the part of the answer to that question is to design the study up front with very clear expectations of what's going to happen with the data and also how the reviews are going to happen. And we were very careful about that. So from my personal experience, when companies have been tense about what's being released, it's usually not the emissions data. or the total emissions estimate, it's usually about things like production numbers, which are trade secrets or competitive secrets. So that's been a little bit more of the intensity around it is around things that are kind of like business information systems as opposed to things that are related to emissions. The other thing, though, we did was that there is potentially some cooperation bias, right? So the people that we work with may be more effective on how they're handling at least methane emissions. And so we did a comparison, and people can talk to me about it afterward. We won't go into the details, but we did a comparison on the TNS study between the greenhouse gas reporting program emissions from our partners and from non-partners, and the partner emissions were lower for measured values. That's actually in the paper. And so we do have to incorporate those kinds of information into the national model. So when we modeled national emissions for TNS, for example, we have different factors for different types of companies that we had to study. So it's very important, I think, to kind of root around a little bit and find where those biases are. And to do that, you have to have this agreement up front with all the participants, EDF, et cetera, as well as the companies on how that's going to be done.
In your example, in your talk, you actually presented some basin data but couldn't present where it came from because of its proprietary nature. Is that right?
Well, I think that there's some sensitivity about the basin because the operators, not every partner of the study is an operator in that basin. And so that reduces the number of you kind of whose sites you were on. It gets reduced by knowing which basin and which companies at the same time.
This is such an important point. I want to turn to the audience in a minute, but I want to draw out one other piece of this that I think is really interesting, and wondered if Ken and you had comment, or perhaps others, because the Water Watch program is an opportunity now to sort of collect public perceptive information. You now have a channel. Anybody can go online real time, look at the website. And I wonder, you mentioned it's been up for a couple of years. What has it taught us about that engagement in terms of the perceptive lens that we now have a real-time open channel to the community on in an important area that we're providing information on? Have we learned things from the social media channel or the more public face that we've created with a program like Colorado Water Watch?
I don't think I can describe any broad conclusions. We do get maybe a few hundred hits a day, so people are looking at it, and it's structured as a site that like we were talking about this morning, communication and information. And I think the challenge is maybe what Mayor Holton said, which is, we're doing this for the public largely, and he seemed to indicate that the public maybe doesn't care. They just care about the diesel truck going down their street, and it might be somewhere in between. So we need to figure out. We put a lot of effort actually in working with Noble and others to how do you communicate data, complex data, to the public, and so that's probably an area that we could do better at.
Let me see, since this area of neutrality, bias, sort of the university's role, see if anyone in the audience has a question or comment in this regard, or any other question or comment they'd like to add at this time.
My name is Jerry Daw. I understand that these additives that they use for fracking to reduce friction, some of them are proprietary, and I'd like to ask if you think that research regarding the environmental impacts of these proprietary additives are necessary and can be done at the university.
Well, I'll talk about that because I think we'd probably see them first in water. And there actually has been a fair amount of work done, and more so at the University of Colorado and their air, water, gas research network. But also, we do a lot of monitoring of produced water and aquifers, and we do look for those kind of things. But that is something that probably is unique to a university.
Just to follow up, I mean, I think part of the question was if those compounds are proprietary, does that information get released to the public around the health effects of those compounds?
So there, that's more of a regulatory question than a scientific one. But what I will say is that what makes this even more complex is that there's two ways you can be exposed to these compounds. The frac fluid itself can be spilled, and on the surface you could breathe some of the compounds that come off, or be exposed to it other ways, or the produced water. And what makes it more complicated with the produced water is that these compounds have now undergone a pretty aggressive temperature, pressure, and oxidative environment downhole. And so even if it was compound X when it went in, there is very little knowledge about what it is when it's in produced water. Actually, we've had some discussions with people like EDF. They're interested in this. So it is it is something that I think is on people's minds in universities.
Wait just 1 minute. The microphone's on its way. Appreciate it. You have more questions submitted via the app? Yes. Just a reminder, you can submit questions via live stream. Go ahead.
So this is for Anthony or Dan. I'm wondering how the age of facilities would be considered.
So this is the answer people really don't like to hear, but what we did is we looked at correlations between emissions and to the extent we had it, age of facility, size of facility, number of other factors, and at least in TNS, there was no correlation, 0. Or, R squared of 0.1, that type of thing. And what's driving that to a large extent is the quantity of emissions is largely related to the number of devices or that are malfunctioning. And if they're malfunctioning, how large the emission is during that malfunction. So it almost becomes more of a question of what the failure rate is and what the catch rate is on the failures in terms of magnitude of emissions. Okay, now, in terms of the count of emission sources, that's correlated, but we didn't see any correlation with age of the system.
One thing I would, is this one on?
They're both on.
So one thing I would add, what we found, so we used our data to scale up to a national estimate, and we used state gathering facility data to do that scale up. And what we found is that the emissions from a given state in the United States were, as you might expect, they were related to the number of gathering facilities per total gas produced. And so where age can sort of come in, if we look at what's going on in the Marcellus shale, there's a lot of, that gas doesn't really need to be processed at all. It comes out of the ground at 97% methane. And so you have some very, very large gathering facilities that are handling a lot of gas. And so that actually results in less overall emissions. A lot of very, very small facilities will produce more overall emissions than very few large facilities. And so one might say that's an age related because those are new facilities and kind of a new way of building the gathering network.
So for Tony and Dan, a question came in from the audience about the fugitive emission studies and noted that they're focused a bit on the wellhead to consumer, but the question is really about the contributions of natural geological sources of methane and whether those have been considered. Or even yesterday we had some talks on natural sources of emissions. Are those factored into the study, or how have they been accounted for? Are they considered to be significant contributions?
So I can take that for my specific study. So for the TNS study, we're studying facilities. So no, we didn't do anything with any surrounding areas. And the tracer flux methods and the on-site sampling methods are made to, designed to capture emissions measurements at those sources. So they don't pick up what's around. Now, in the case of the basin level one, we do have to accommodate that, right? So, for example, there are some places where the shale has an outcrop, and there's a migration of the natural gas along the outcrop of the shale. And if that's in the right orientation relative to wind, you may see some effects from geologic formations. And then the next one behind that is basically abandoned facilities, so mines and wells particularly.
Before I turn to the audience, one of the other things that I think is worth bringing out in this session is that, we've used the word solutions, and solutions really are a system that one uses to make a decision in order to change something about the practice. And you've heard different components of this. I mean, clearly a system has to start with a baseline of information and characterization, which the EDF study I think is a great example of. Ken Carlson and Jeff's work as well in terms of characterization of environmental contaminants, methane and others. You've heard about the technologies, sensors and detectors, or perhaps technologies to convert water in its use. I'd like to ask you about putting these things together because, a solution is in fact a system, and a sensor is a measurement, but you've got to figure out, in your case, Azer, how does that detection modality lead to an answer that I'm going to use to do something? And I'm sure those in the industry think about that. Okay, I've got a great sensor. I can put it on a drone. I can put it on a truck. I can make a measurement with it. But I've got to be able to put it into some sort of information system that drives to some operating change, or I'm going to do something. And I'm curious if you would talk about that in terms of how you think about that, because you're each working on a different part of that system solution, but in some ways, components of it. I'm wondering how you think about putting these things together into system solutions.
Well, that's great. That's a great question. We are rather focused on the sensor itself, but absolutely that needs to be part of a larger system. I mean, one interesting point is that our sensor itself is part of a system in itself. And so what I mean is that for the sensor to give some meaningful information, you need to combine it with the geospatial information of where that sensor moves around. You probably need to combine it with the wind speed information. And then one needs analytics based on all of that to locate and to quantify the emissions. And then I think it really depends perhaps who the customer is or who's using that sensor. So I mean, one potential role of these sensors is to meet the regulatory needs. Another potential role, and I'd like to better understand this, is basically how much incentive the companies have to use these measurements to then say, okay, we need to find, I mean, one thing is to go in and fix some leaks, and then the other thing is to think if there's more systematic changes they need to make to their hardware and to these components that these guys are looking at. So I don't have the full answer there, but obviously the sensor is a key part of that gives the information that can then drive these other changes.
One thing I might add is, sometimes the systems that we talk about are not just sensor systems, but even operating practices. And so, what we found in gathering two identical facilities, we drive up to one of them and it could be leaking at between 1 and 10% of its gas. We go to the next facility, identical facility, and it's leaking less than 0.1% of its gas. And the challenge is it's kind of like the whack-a-mole game, right? I mean, in these things, you have these events that occur, and we don't know how long they last, but if you can quickly detect those events and quickly repair them. In many cases, when we went to a facility and it was in this high emitting state, we told our escort, who was an operator, hey, you really should take a look at this. And in some cases, within 15 minutes, they had it repaired, because it wasn't a component that broke. It was a valve stuck open. They had to just tweak a spring, and the emissions went away. So that's one of the other benefits of partnering with the companies on these studies, because we know that they've learned a lot by just engaging in this study, and they may have already changed some operating practices based on what we found.
A little bit different perspective on solutions, thinking sort of more broader about regional air quality issues. And for example, very recently, EPA promulgated a new ozone standard, and CDPHE will be very involved in coming up with a state implementation plan about how to meet that. And so there's also this aspect of having information about what emissions are, how those emissions behave in the atmosphere, and contribute as part of a bigger mix of things, right? We have oil and gas emissions on the Front Range, but we're all driving cars, we have power plants, we have agriculture, we have all kinds of different kinds of sources, and we need to understand the components, the contributions from each of those. And that's a complex problem, but it starts with understanding what's coming out of those different sources. And so a lot of the work that's going on here at CSU will feed into that kind of solution as well.
Let me just turn to see if there's an audience question. I want to give people as much opportunity as possible. Yeah, I see someone's hand up there in the back. We'll get a mic to you pronto.
I'd like to ask the panel if they see a role for citizen air monitoring or methane monitoring done by the community. Right now, the only boots on the ground are coming from the State Oil and Gas Commission.
Anybody want to tackle that? I know John Volkins isn't on our panel, but we have a faculty member in an effort in just that, sort of wearable badges for air quality, and we have a significant investment in sort of looking at air quality, climate, and health, and considering citizen science as a key component of that. So I appreciate your question that the feed of information was a little bit behind my question about the Colorado Water Watch as well, because there's an example where citizens have access to information about their environment in a real-time way. But anyone else want to comment?
Let me add something else about water. We got a comment on a previous panel that I wasn't able to relay, is someone said, remind people that Weld County has a program where you, free of charge, you can take a sample of your water to one of their facilities, one of their labs, and they will measure the things you want measured, like VOCs, BTECs, that kind of stuff. So in a way, that's citizen monitoring. And I, that's free of charge.
I think for methane sensing, people would love to go that direction. I mean, if you saw my discussion on the sensors, I mean, we're sort of trying to make these things smaller and less expensive, but it still isn't such that, everyone's going to have their own. The ultimate vision is to have a little methane sensor inside of your cell phone, and maybe one day we'll figure out how to do that with laser spectrometers, but it's just a very challenging problem. I did show some examples of these passive canister type methods. And those actually can be, I think, quite inexpensive, and sure, they don't give time and spatially resolved information, but one could envisage certainly setting those up in more and more locations, and then kind of having a network of measurements.
So I think that for the measurements that we're doing right now requires the sensitivities that Azer mentioned earlier, which is parts per billion sorts of sensitivities. That's to get quantitative measurements. I think one of the areas we haven't really thought through on methane, for example, is what you could do with non-quantitative or qualitative information, and whether there's ways to find large events or large emitting sources using non-quantitative. I think that's kind of an open topic.
I want to bring Mark in here because Mark, you and I are biologists, and I appreciate your issue around looking at the ecosystem. But I can imagine industry and the sector kind of looks at this and says, what list? How long is this list? And putting things on and off this list, whether it's a sage grouse or a rare species plant. How do we think about the management of the ecosystem around these operations, and what is the responsibility that we have? And when I say we, I think you can answer that certainly from a CSU perspective, because we have a very rich faculty and interest in what Mark touched upon and in his own work. But how do we bring this forward in the industry, and what is the expectation of the social contract with regard to speciation and biodiversity?
I think in the Piceance Basin, it's particularly relevant because you have such unique biodiversity there because of the endemic species. And it creates challenges, but as I pointed out, hopefully it also creates a lot of opportunities. So for example, the two species that we were working with, we were able to, because we had two species, there were areas that were off limits to development already, and we were able to move one species to the location of another species and not impact potential future development in those areas. So that affords a possibility in terms of where oil and gas companies are operating. If they happen to own the surface rights, there's opportunities for them to contribute to bringing greater abundance of these species in their own operations. And one of the common misconceptions about plants that are threatened and endangered is they're very different than animals. They're regulated very differently than animals are. There's no such thing as there's no allowance for take of federally listed plants. So they're not afforded the same level of protection as, say, wolves are. So when we first started talking about moving these plants around, it generated a lot of emotions. But the important thing to remember is that if it's private land, you can do anything you want with threatened and endangered plants. And again, that affords another unique opportunity for the industry to be involved in the protection of these species and other species as well. Maybe not so much for sage grouse, because they can get up and move and colonize new areas where they would then be afforded protection. But with plants, I think there's a lot of unique opportunities, not only to move them around, but also to create habitats that are appropriate for them to conserve them.
Do you see the engineering tools in biology sort of as a alternate solution to this problem? I mean, in the sense that we can create synthetic organisms now, will we have the tools to recapitulate diversity in the spaces we want to do that?
Well, that opens up a whole nother set of regulations that we probably don't want to get into, but certainly it does provide a lot of potential there. And I think as we start to think about how environments are changing with climate change, we have to think about these plants and the work that we're doing on them, and are we wasting our time? Are these things going to be extinct? Can we move them? And I think that's where those sort of technologies really come into play as we start to think more broadly about how organisms move in the environment and where they can and cannot move, how we can use those engineering solutions to help conserve that biodiversity.
We have about 10 minutes left, and now again, send it back to the audience and see if there's a question out there. I think there is in the back.
So this question was more with regards to water quality. I was wondering, how do you bridge the gap between regulation and the proprietary nature of additives? So if you don't know what is being added to water for fracking use or well stimulation, then how do you create regulations on water quality for different levels of reuse?
I guess that's for me, and that's a good question. I think a controversial question. One of the ways I look at it is that there's nothing that I know of that's more toxic that's being put into the ground as an additive than stuff that is already there coming back in the water. And I think I said this yesterday, take a conventional well that is not fracked, and the water coming back is a hazardous substance that you would not want to deal with. It's treated that way. And benzene, toluene, that kind of stuff. And so unless we identify, and we haven't, that there is some additive that is, let's say, more toxic or more likely to move in the subsurface if it's spilled and not degrade, we look for surrogates that we know should be there, like BTEX. So that might not be a completely fulfilling answer, but I think that's the way a lot of us look at it.
A hand up over there. We'll get your mic.
Hi there. I'm Johnny Roos with Soil and Crop Science, and I had a more general question about innovation. We're talking about solutions. So does the panel, and Alan, maybe you have some insight on this as well, does innovation really get driven by a more flexible atmosphere, or do you guys believe and how that stricter regulation maybe drives innovations and solutions?
There's a lot of paths to innovation, and in my experience, it often starts with defining an unmet need, and then seeing different creative solutions to that unmet need emerge. At some point, they have to have a target product profile as they mature, but the path to getting to an unmet need can take many different elements of risk, many different elements of creativity, and that, to me, is where the innovation flows. But I'll turn it over and let my panel.
I would just comment that in many cases, I mean, not everybody might like to hear this, but in many cases, regulation can drive innovation, because if the regulations are such that people need to monitor every one of their facilities 24/7, but right now it's too expensive for the company to do that, that opens up a business opportunity, right, to find a solution that is cost effective. And I think, that's what Azer is working on, and many of us.
Yeah, but I would also say the other thing that drives innovation is, it's related to that, is let's say the commodity cost. The fact that the oil prices dropped to the level that it has really driven operator service companies to look at how their operations are done. And so with respect to, let's say, water management, it wasn't that important a few years ago because of the profit margins. It is now critical. And so I've seen actually a pretty big uptick in their interest in innovating in this area.
About 5 minutes less. The last topic, which we haven't talked about, but could be an opportunity over lunch to have some conversation around, is workforce development. Many industry works with CSU in providing solutions, technology solutions as a component, if not other types of solutions. But industry comes to us, I think, with also a need for workforce development. So I'd like to ask the panel, what's your view of this? How have you seen the student dynamics change? And higher ed's in a very interesting place around the delivery of education. What have you seen in terms of trends for training students for the industry and the challenges that they'll face in the future?
Maybe I can start on that topic. Atmospheric Science is a graduate-only program, but not all of our graduates go on to be faculty members. A lot of them go out to work at government labs or in the private sector. And for us, probably the biggest workforce development in this area is people that go out to work for environmental consulting companies and then work with industry. And one of the things I've seen since we've been working on this topic and other sorts of applied research topics is this really appeals to a lot of students. They want to feel that they're making a difference, that they can go out and tackle a problem that people are talking about, an issue that people care about, and I think that helps attract really bright young people into the sciences or engineering to think about how they can have an impact on the world going forward. And that, especially with the current generation of students, I think that's a big focus for them. And so things like this and issues like this that they can train to go out and work on, they find very attractive.
Yeah, I will echo that. I think the best experience the grad students I have is interacting with industry, interacting with government, interacting in the real world.
And I would say, certainly in mechanical engineering over the last 5 to 10 years, probably 50% or 35% of our graduates have been getting jobs from a lot of our sponsors in, in the oil and gas industry. So, it's up to us to prepare them not only technically, but also to understand public policy and global and societal impact that they will make as engineers when they embark on their career.
Yeah, so I run into students pretty much when they're grad students already, running the research program. But I think that what I see is that when we offer, we have our grad students come in, and you say, well, welcome to CSU. Get your bags packed. We're going to send you off to a distant location and have you walk around in a field with methane detectors and 5 folks from the company. That's a unique experience. And it's a kind of unique educational and training experience as well about how you behave in those situations and how you learn things on the ground. And so I think that the one thing that we can offer is that ability to actually be part of the action. It's not back in the lab.
Yeah, and I think that's where industry can play a really big role, and it's happening right now in our college. We have Chevron set up a program of fellowships, and we have 5 Chevron fellows who are working on environmental issues around oil and gas development over in the Piceance Basin, very hands-on with Chevron, and that's a wonderful opportunity for those students to understand how industry operates and what it's like to be on the other side, on the industry side. So great program.
Well, as promised, I wouldn't keep you from lunch, and I know Maury is also watching the clock as well. So with that, I'll thank you for your participation and listening. I'll thank our panel for their comments and presentations, and look forward to chatting a little bit more with you over lunch. Thank you.
Please give him a hand. Thank you.